This is Premal from Accorian. Thanks for attending. We're going to be talking about NIST CSF today. Just some logistical. If you have questions, feel free to put them right into the Q&A part. We'll try to get to them as we go through it. The way we're approaching this today is very much where I'm going to be asking Aditya questions around NIST, and he's going to be responding to it and talking about what is NIST and how to use it and how to leverage it. So hopefully you get some value out of it. Feel free to ask questions. We'll see if we can get to those as we go through the presentation and the webinar. Very quickly to introduce myself, I'm a founder of Accorian. We're a cybersecurity firm, been in the business of compliance and security strategy for a number of years. Aditya, do you want to quickly say hi and then we'll talk through it?
Good afternoon all. My name is Aaditya. I am the head of cybersecurity and managing director at Accorian.
Excellent. Why don't we hit the next slide? Just, quickly, just to introduce ourselves, I'll go through this very quickly. As I mentioned, we're a cybersecurity firm. We help our clients all the way from security strategy. What should you care about from a security perspective? Compliance, whether it's NIST, HITRUST, ISO, SOC 2, any other acronym you can think of. Helping them with program management, policy procedure writing, and then also a lot of security testing, things like red teaming, phishing, pen testing. So really full cycle cybersecurity for our clients across the globe. From an experience perspective, we have done a number of engagements around all the acronyms, right? We are HITRUST assessors. We can do SOC 2 audits. We do a lot of NIST work as well. Our team is global, based in the US with offices in Dubai and India, and then working across different industries, health, fintech, SaaS being some of the key ones. So without spending more time on Accorian, let's talk about NIST. So one of the first questions is, Aditya, is just what is NIST? So we want to talk to that and start from there.
Absolutely. So NIST was actually created by the US Department of Commerce. It has evolved in the last 80 years or so from something that was just used for measurement of everyday items or having some kind of benchmark or standard for that. Today it's being leveraged for multiple things, including cybersecurity. So NIST today stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it has evolved, right? The NIST CSF is a product of it. It typically helps organizations to understand and manage their cybersecurity, and it's across all businesses and types of industries and customer size, right? So it is typically a voluntary framework that's been put together by NIST as a guideline for organizations to better understand their current security posture and try and see if they can become more secure over time.
Cool. And so, Aditya, one of the things is there's NIST CSF, there's NIST 853, there is SOC 2, there's ISO. What is the difference between all these different standards and which one should we care about, if you will?
Yeah. So there are a ton of frameworks out there. They all have the same acronyms. They all have the same names. What is it that one should, sorry, one second. So there are a bunch of acronyms out there. They're all different frameworks. NIST has various types. There's the 853, there's 800, 171. It can be confusing, right? So to put forth and to clarify some of that, the NIST CSF and 853, 800, 171 are from the same organization, but have very, very different use cases. The NIST CSF, while it's voluntary, it's free, it's concise, and builds on existing frameworks like the NIST 853, COVID, ISO 27001 and 27002. It is very different from 853. 853 is a more regulatory document. It is for federal organizations that come in contact with classified information, and it is a basis and a means in order to comply with the FIPS 200 certification. Right? So that's the basic difference. Then the CSF was created so that the US can share a standard for organizations to better protect themselves, especially critical infrastructure. whereas 853 is more enforceable. It has a certification associated to it if it's 200, and it's to do with protection of classified information. Now, that was the first part. The second is there are tons of different standards out there, SOC 2, ISO, etc. The basic difference is that the ISO, SOC 2, other types of standards are certifiable, and they are more about auditing against a set number of requirements, whereas the NIST CSF is a guideline, is a list of good practices and processes an organization should have. So rather than having an attestation of certification as your end goal, what you can expect from the NIST CSF is a benchmark and a way and means to understand your current maturity. One other point that I really want to quickly call out is the fact that the NIST CSF is a concise framework. It's only 40 pages, unlike other standards and frameworks, right? So it is up to you to apply, understand it. It's great for executives to go through, understand what can be done from a security standpoint. Unlike the ISO with 108 requirements, or the NIST 853 with over 460 pages of literature.
Is it fair to say, Aditya, that and tell me if I'm wrong, is NIST CSF is a subset of 853?
So I wouldn't classify it as a subset. It has taken certain requirements or certain guidelines from the 853, but it's an amalgamation of various types of standards. The NIST essentially put it together, keeping in mind that can we build a set of practices that is repeatable, that is adaptable, that can be easily managed and maintained for organizations, right? And cutting across various segments and various sizes of organizations. So they've kept in mind that you could very well have a 20-person organization looking at the NIST CSF. You could also have a 20,000 employee count organization looking at this. Cool. So it's something that you can evolve with over time.
Got it. So let's talk about more details of NIST CSF. If that's what is it in a bit more detail, if you will.
Yeah. So to take a very quick deep dive into the NIST CSF, some of the advantages that I want to go through quickly first. The NIST CSF is a great way to understand your current security posture and what is your maturity, right? If you really want to benchmark your current security management process or your program, this is what you use as a framework. Next is, it's a great way to share and increase the culture of information security, because unlike certifications, the NIST CSF is more of something that evolves over time. There's no end goal, right? There's no, I will get my certificate and then I can go back to my old days, right? This is about maintaining these standards day in and day out so that you become more secure every day, right? This in turn improves overall information security posture, and this allows you to showcase a greater posture to your clients and management, etc. So in all, it's a great way to think from a business standpoint and become more secure. Now, to quickly look at what does the NIST CSF entail. The NIST CSF essentially has various, so the NIST CSF is essentially, like I said, it's a set of practices, protocols, standards, and recommendations, right? It has 5 main functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. These are the core functions or security functions that NIST CSF includes. It's a little different from the type of standards that we've typically seen like ISO or SOC 2, because this gives a lot more emphasis on response and recover, unlike just having the necessary practices in place, right? From an implementation standpoint, there are 4 levels. The first is partial, the second is risk-informed, third is repeatable, and the fourth is adaptive. Now, to give you a very quick example, shadow IT is a very big problem organizations face as they grow and scale. Organizations have assets on the internet. They don't know, they won't be able to protect it unless they don't know about it. So asset management becomes very, very important, right? In that particular scenario, if I were to take that example, if an organization has some methodology using a vulnerability scan to detect these shadow assets every year, then I would say it's a partial implementation. Yes, they are finding this data, but they're waiting for some trigger event to happen, or possibly even a breach wherein this particular asset is used as a point of pivot to get into the network, right? So it's a very reactive way of doing it. So if that's how an organization is looking at asset management, then it's tier one. Tier two is risk informed, where they have some process, but it's not documented. They understand this risk exists, so they're trying to do some kind of scan every now and then, but it's not documented. It's more dynamic. It's based on the timeline or the goals of the IT team, right? So it's more ad hoc, right? Tier three is repeatable, where there's a policy procedure in place, but there's maybe the policy procedure calls out that you have to do an asset management, or you have to do an asset discovery scan every month, right? It's a manual process, so it's not very repeatable. There is a tool, or there may not be a tool, so it becomes more laborious. There is a policy procedure that helps you do it every month, but then because a tool may or may not exist, it's not very adaptive. It's not real time, right? You may not be able to detect it. Say somebody brings up an asset one day after your scan, what happens then, right? So that's tier four, which is more adaptive, right? Where you have, say, a constant scanner that's looking for your assets on the internet, and then say on the next day there's something that comes up on the internet that belongs to your organization. It could be an S3 that's exposed of the organization. You get a trigger or an alert saying that, hey, there's a new asset that's being detected associated to your organization. So those are the four levels, right? And how implementation varies across these four tiers. Now there's a third part to the framework, which is called as profile. Like I mentioned, the NIST CSF believes in more adaptability and helping organizations have more repeatable processes, right? So the NIST CSF will allow you to understand what is your current posture, which we will call as your current profile, which is what kind of SOPs, what kind of security framework do you have, what kind of security controls and tools do you have in place, right? This will in turn help you understand what kind of gaps do you have, and how do you identify the gaps is the NIST CSF, unlike other standards, typically has some way to benchmark for your industry. So if you're a financial services industry, you can find out what is the average maturity of organizations across financial services. Or if you're a healthcare organization, you could get this information from NIST itself. So a level that you're trying to attain within your particular industry, which then in turn becomes a goal for you to start working towards, right? So once you know that, and that becomes your target profile, your desired maturity, right? So the time that is spent between going from your current profile to your target profile is the remediation, where you write up better policy procedures that become your security framework. You implement the necessary controls and tools that allow you to become more secure, that helps you move towards your desired maturity. So that is a very quick introduction into the NIST CSF framework. I know I did not speak about the 5 functions, so I'm going to talk about it real quickly. The 5 functions are right here. You have identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Now, most standards or frameworks typically are emphasizing on identify and protect, right? There are some that emphasize on respond and recover, and they have various different requirements, but the NIST CSF looks at it very differently. So as part of identify, you need to first understand, what creates your entire organization. So your assets, your business environment, what kind of governance structure do you have? What kind of risk assessment or risk management processes do you have internally? That goes into identification, which allows you to understand how is it that you can get started on this process? So that's the first part. The second part is protection, which is essentially, as we call, implementation of controls, the basic set of controls that one should have, which is access control, password policies, awareness and training, data security, all of your policy procedures that formulate your security framework, maintenance, and any protective technology like 24/7. Right. So that is the first two parts, and that typically is where most organizations lie today, when they're able to identify and have necessary controls in place. But then comes the entire thing about improvement and how does one become better. So that's where the detect, respond, and recover comes. So detect is, if any of these controls fail, do you have an ability to find out the anomaly and event? So, after protect, most organizations typically should spend time on baselining, what is, the environment looking like. So tomorrow you see that, say, there's every day 100 MB of data is going out, and suddenly a GB goes out for the next 5 days. Right? The ability to detect this anomaly is what is being called out in the detect, function, right? Continuous monitoring of your security controls to ensure that these controls are in place, are being implemented properly, and that they are functional, right? And so having this detection mechanism, not only in the case that it's being detected and forgotten about, but then somebody is taking action. So that's where the response comes, right? So somebody is actioning upon it. You have SLAs, there's a response planning, a workflow, there's some communication mechanism, there's some kind of analysis, and key takeaways from an improvement standpoint. So that creates the detect and response pair. Then comes the recover part, which is all about, say there's an anomaly, responded to it. In certain cases, you might have to, plan for your recovery. You might have to, go into a contingency plan, BCPDR, etc. That is what recover typically talks about. But it also talks about a very important aspect, which is communication, and how you relay this information to stakeholders and other, statutory bodies. So very quick introduction as to what the 5 functions are.
Hey, Aaditya, someone had a question specifically, if you don't mind, which is, you talked about target profiles and being able to measure against an industry, if you will.
Yeah.
Is it available? Is the link we can send out? Where would they find it?
Sure. So there are links available. The easiest thing is just, on Google, hit NIST target profile and put your industry name. You will essentially get a PDF document, right? We have a slider of all the various industries and what their target profile should look like. If you'd like, you could just drop us your email address and we'd be more than happy to send it over to you.
Yeah, I think whoever asked that question, if you want to send either me or Aaditya or the marketing team an email, we can get that back to you as well.
Yeah. Or you could just leave your email in the chat and we'll pick it up from there. All right. So that was to do with the NIST CSF framework and a little bit of an introduction. Now,
I think you've got to the next question. Who does it apply to, right? In terms of NIST.
Yeah. Yeah. So, high trust applies to health, SOC 2 is typically today being looked at for service providers, SaaS, anybody with client data. But who does NIST CSF typically apply to? So like I mentioned, it was first formulated as a way or a framework that any organization in any industry, irrespective of size, can start implementing. It is truly a benchmark a framework that cuts across all segments, right? So whether you're in energy, material, manufacturing, utilities, healthcare, financial services, consumer goods, FMCG, communication services, real estate, IT, etc. It would, be a framework that you can very, very easily apply to your organization. From the latest statistics, over 70% of large organizations are implementing NIST, and over 50% of small to medium-sized organizations are looking at NIST. Right? The advantages are multifold. Like I mentioned, it kind of helps you evolve over time, and it's more, less reactive and more, adaptive as a security framework. And that's why it is the go-to framework for all of these various industries. Also, the NIST CSF has been advocated through an executive order as the framework to look at in case you have if you're part of the critical infrastructure group.
So Aditya, as you mentioned, there are lots of different acronyms, right? There's SOC 2, there's ISO, there's NIST. If I'm already SOC 2 certified, do I still need to think about NIST? Does it add value?
Yeah, so I think that's a very, very common question. I already have a SOC 2. Why should I think about NIST? Why should I spend more time in getting more secure? So there's no end goal in security, right? Attackers are getting better. Threats are more imminent. Attackers are finding new ways to evade whatever tools are out there. So like I mentioned earlier, the NIST CSF is less reactive, more adaptive, right? So it is a technical framework, which rather than a standard, and it allows you to customize your controls. They're not rigid requirements that you got to control, or you got to design your control in this way, right? You have the liberty to customize your controls into whatever format that you'd like. So, rather than going down a certain path, if you think that this particular control needs to be implemented a certain way, or say you don't want to buy a tool, you want to have various different, settings or principles or detection mechanisms that you can, you would rather have, rather than having a particular tool, you can more, do so, right? So as long as it meets the, framework in the end. So it's more flexible rather than rigid. Next is the NIST CSF is more internal. It focuses on improvement and continuous maintenance. There is no certification. So, at the end, you don't get any certification. It's just about self-realization, understanding where you at, and improving day on day. One point that, yeah. One point that I want to call out, typically, attestation, SOC 2, certification, ISO, and the other certification standards out there, by virtue of achieving ISO 27001, you only actually meet 60% of NIST CSF as a requirement, right? So that typically can go into telling that, standards, while focusing on implementation and making sure the necessary controls and policy procedures exist, they don't focus a lot on adaptability, recovery, and response, right? That's what the NIST CSF, helps in building. Lastly, it's a great way to, it's a great standard or framework to leverage as a common control standard, so that you can use this as a way to adopt new standards and frameworks. By virtue of rolling out the CSF to the best of your ability, you'll be able to meet multiple different standards and frameworks because of the sheer focus on response and recovery.
Yeah, I think just if I add my 2 cents to this, what we've seen from our clients is they use the SOC 2 ISO to measure certification, use that both, of course, for security, but also for marketing, frankly, right? That's what they give to their clients, saying, look, we're SOC 2 attested, here's the certification behind it, or here's the report behind it. Where we see our clients is they use NIST more for internal benchmarking against their industry, and how do we get better, right? So when you think of a SOC 2 audit, you're going, it's an audit, right? So you have an auditor and you are really the person getting audited, right? So that relationship is a bit different. When you're doing a NIST assessment, if you're using a third party or internal, it's really, how do I get better? What are my weaknesses? How do I improve? So the mindset's a bit different too. I don't know if you would agree with me on that.
No, I completely agree with you. You're sharing your laundry rather than hiding it. Internally and externally. So, your mindset, there's a massive mindset change, and you're thinking about growth and improvement rather than hiding certain elements associated to environment or security posture.
Yeah, and if someone's got a question, feel free to put it into the Q&A. We'll get to it. I know someone's raised their hand, so if they want to put a question in, That works. One question around this, Aditya, was isn't CSF also more focused on cloud controls as opposed to SOC 2, which may not be?
So the CSF applies to security in whole, whether you have, at large actually, whether you're on-prem, colo, whether you're on the cloud, the CSF would apply. The principles of CSF would apply. The SOC 2 doesn't typically call out cloud, but same thing, there are controls that are present in SOC 2 that should ideally, be applied on both your on-prem and cloud network. What typically happens is organizations may not completely implement some of these controls by virtue of sub-service organizations in the case of SOC 2, because you inherit a lot of good security. Secondly, auditors focus more on on-prem, and they assume that the cloud setup is okay, right? And because you're on the cloud, you're already secure. So auditors may not push as much on understanding what's happening on the cloud, from a control implementation standpoint. That's what we've seen, off late. But that said, both do look at it, just that it's about, what is the auditors and what kind of adherence are we seeing?
So how do so I get what NIST CSF is, I understand some of the value behind it. How do I roll it out, right? How do I get started? What should I do?
So rolling out NIST CSF is always an interesting challenge. So I will just put down some basic steps. I think first it's important to prioritize, which segment of your organization do you want to roll it out? Do you want to have it across the entire organization? We've typically seen that organizations might want to start with the most important business units that have the most critical functions, processes, or data, right? So, or if you're doing it organization-wide, it's very important to understand your scope. So scope your entire organization, understand, the identify part of the CSF. Very important to understand this and prioritize, right? Amalgamate asset intelligence, right? Understand what is the criticality of each function or asset and prioritize that so that you can focus on them differently by when you start rolling out the CSF as a framework. So that's the first part. Second is create or understand your current profile. Understand where you at as an organization. What are your current gaps? What are your current controls that you've implemented? What are your current processes that you have in place? What are the current processes that are partial, right? What are the current policies and procedures that are incomplete or that have been completely rolled out? This will give you an understanding of where is it that, what is your starting point, right? Next is, and in order to do so, you're typically conducting a maturity assessment internally or a risk assessment to understand more about your organization. Once that's done, what will essentially happen is you'll have a report, you'll have an understanding of your current maturity and posture. Next is, it's important to understand what is your goal, right? So where is it that you're trying to get to? So what is your target profile? You might have a target profile for your industry type. It might be something that's set by an internal auditor. It might be something that's even set by your PE firm, right? So that becomes a target that you need to start working towards to attain, right? So once that's done, you can start analyzing and prioritizing your gaps and putting together an action plan and rolling out the necessary implementations that you need to have to, get to a better security posture. So that's to do with the implementation. There are more steps associated to this. This is just a starting point. I want to quickly talk about the maturity assessment and what can one possibly do, right? So I've broken it up into 3 parts, right? So if, forget the target profile, forget the current profile, forget the, profiles for a second. It's very, very important to first understand where you at and what are your gaps. So if I were to look at it, and this is essentially how Accorian does their, NIST CSF maturity assessment for customers. We essentially start looking at, what kind of start looking at the assets, start understanding the IT and security structure, start assessing, what kind of critical assets do you have, what are your critical workflows, processes, what does your current data flow look like, understand, assets and their criticality mapping, understand what kind of security controls do you have in place, understand what kind of third-party risks come into play, right? Understand if there have been previous incidents, understand what is current employee awareness. So all of this goes into creating your current state, maturity understanding. And this only becomes better by sending very targeted questionnaires to the end risk owners or control owners or asset owners, by doing the necessary interviews to truly understand if a process has been implemented, is it working, right? Will they be able to furnish evidence that a process has worked or a control has been in place from X amount of time, right? So this truly will give you the best way or best understanding of the current state. Next is when we move to the gap analysis, where we start doing sampling checks or sample checks on adherence. We start going through the policy procedures to see depth. We start looking at what missing controls are present. We start reviewing the risk assessment results, looking at the penetration testing and vulnerability scanning results, identifying all the gaps, and then putting together a report, right? So that's to do with, now that the gaps have been identified, the final step is to put together the roadmap, prioritize all your gaps, understand, what do you have to do in order to start remediation, put your quick wins first up, put the difficult ones maybe a little later, the ones that need a little more planning, start bringing in the necessary asset and risk owners so that they start thinking about it, start talking to the vendors, etc. But all of this has to be done, through a very targeted and well-planned roadmap. And this roadmap will help you achieve your target profile.
Yeah, and Aaditya, what I'd say is, where we get involved as Accorian is in the maturity assessment. A lot of our clients will say, we want a third party to look at where we are and measure us, for lack of a better word. Not for a SOC 2, not for an external party, but more for an internal evaluation. And the reason they use a third party, because clearly there is no certification, right? This is much more about getting better, if you will. The reason they want to use a third party is really to avoid what we call optimistic bias, right? Which is, I think we do it, we must be doing it, as opposed to show me that you've done it. And so I think that's where we come in. That's why we want a third party independent look at things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. There was a question around, are we going to share this deck? Yeah, absolutely. We'll send it out after this. Give us a day or so. But absolutely, it'll be shared with anybody who's on. It's also getting recorded, so I'm assuming the recording also will be available. The next slide, if you want to hit it quickly, is to summarize, and I'll take this one, is NIST CSF allows you to measure your maturity against other companies. I think, frankly, being a CTO in my previous life, that's a big deal, right? Lots of times you get the question of how are we doing against the industry we play in? How much money should we be spending in security? Because there's never enough. What products do we need? And the ability to go and say, here's where we are, having a score, and then looking at your industry and having a score and being able to measure that becomes important. It's also much more internal focused, at least the way most people use it. So, SOC 2, ISO are great tools, don't get me wrong, we do a lot of work around those too, but there is a level of certification and outward facing with the SOC 2 and ISO that doesn't always exist within the CSF. It's also more focused on, as Aaditya mentioned, the recovery side of things, the communication side of things that might not be covered with an ISO 2701. So we do see a lot of our clients using both SOC 2 or ISO independently, getting that certification or attestation, and then doing the NIST CSF more for improvements as well. Drives across industries, not industry focused, unlike HIPAA or high trust, if you will, or PCI. Where companies leverage us is very much to do that independent third-party assessment, focused on more the back end of CSF, right, which is the detect response side of things. And it allows you to go back to your execs with a target profile, understanding your industry and where things need to go, which is, I think, is important. Maybe we should have given a deliverable example of just how that scoring happens, but it is a very scored framework, if you will, right? So you can say, this is my score based on your level, if you will. Is there anything to add there?
No, I think that's spot on. There are a ton of advantages of NIST CSF, just like other standards and frameworks. It is, if you're looking at, rolling out security for the very first time, the NIST CSF is a great fit. But even if you've been doing security for a couple of years and you want to really ramp up on being more adaptive, there's no better framework than this.
Cool. Unless people have other questions, that was the last slide. Appreciate your time. I'm going to give it a minute if there's any other questions. I think we answered the ones that came along. We will share the deck. We will share the link to where you can find target profiles or, where things are there. But otherwise, I think we're good. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you all.